Now, if you heard Brian's presentation earlier, the days of not having to worry about permitting are probably gone. I mean, even very small projects, and again, I'm talking nationwide, can require permits. So I kind of just wanted to go through some options you guys might have in the grain industry. Just real quick, give a plug. I've been working with NACS for about coming up on 3 years now. I've also worked in a regulatory agency in the air permitting program and also in the private sector. As far as NACS goes, our organizational position is we want to be the leader in air quality, water quality, hazardous waste, and risk management. So although I'm an expert in air and we'll be talking to you about that today, if you have other questions outside of that, that's certainly things we can help you with. And really our purpose, we feel, is to help you guys out with regulatory compliance, increased operational flexibility, successful project planning, and liability identification and reduction, and then certainly helping you guys get your permits as quick as possible, which I know is obviously in the grain industry, as things move quickly, you need your permits quickly. And here's just a listing of what we do. My understanding is this stuff will be provided later, so I'm obviously not going to go through all that. First, I just want to talk to you guys about operating permits. I think most everybody here is probably dealing with an existing facility as opposed to building a greenfield at this moment. But we can get into some of that later if you guys have questions. But operating permits typically apply to existing facilities. So operating permits, what's the point? Air quality operating permits. Really, the whole idea behind it is to summarize all of your regulatory requirements into one document. That's supposed to be helpful to you as an operator. There's one place you can go and see everything air quality-wise you have to do. It's also meant to help your regulators and your inspectors. As you dive into this, trying to figure out whether you need an operating permit, the first thing you have to do is decide whether you're a major source, which in this case we're talking about Title V operating permits. Now, most everybody in this room, I'm going to assume, probably is not in the major category. In the grain industry, this is pretty much reserved for the largest grain terminal elevators and those that have exceedingly high throughputs. But if you are in the major category, that will impact what permits you have to get. Otherwise, you are considered a minor source. This is how good the definitions are. Almost every state says you're a minor source if you're not a major source. Pretty simple, right? So in that case, you end up being in the state realm, most generally. So in this case, you would work with here the Nebraska DEQ, for instance, perhaps Indiana Department of Environmental Management, those type of agencies. So the question on everybody's mind, I'm sure, is do I have to get one? Do I have to get an operating permit? And the answer that comes up most of the time in the air realm is it depends. I hate to shrug my shoulders, but you need more detail in order to determine whether you have to get permits. And again, you start with, are you a major source? If you are, your options are pretty limited. You have to get a site-specific Title V operating permit, and those are timely and costly. It takes a fair amount of time to put an application together. A lot of times the Title V permits include performance testing, certain things that cost you guys money. So if we can avoid being a major source, that's normally a good thing. Are you a minor source? Like I said, I think most everyone in here probably is. In that case, you've got options, and options are a good thing. First and foremost, I would check to see if you qualify for an exemption. Now, most state operating permit programs are set up to where there are exemptions. So it is possible that your facility may not need an air permit. But the main thing is you need to check with your permitting authority. So check with your state. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can check with someone like me or anyone else up here. The consultants can certainly guide you through whether you would need one. The criteria is highly variable among the states, and I'll give you this example. I actually had changed that earlier. I'll throw out the example of Nebraska versus Iowa. In the state of Nebraska, you are required to get an operating permit if your particulate matter or PM10, so the small microns that Brian had talked about in his presentation earlier, if your actual emissions exceed 50 tons. Okay, so that's one criteria. However, if you're in the state of Iowa, you actually don't have a minor source operating permit program at all. They only issue Title V permits. So again, depending what state you are operating in, you'll have highly different thresholds and criteria. But if you have an exemption, you're probably going to feel like Kip from Napoleon here, and you're going to be pretty excited because the exemption is the least amount of liability for you guys, and really there's not a whole lot you need to worry about. But if you are exempt, I caution you that you should still keep records. If you've gone through the evaluation and determined you don't need a permit, hang on to that evaluation because essentially in every state, an inspector can show up just to ask you questions. They may ask you, where's your permit? If you can provide a document to them that says, here, I'm exempt, here's my analysis, you'll be left alone. I present these in order of how complex they are and how much regulatory liability is involved with them. If you don't qualify for an exemption, a lot of states will have registration permits, and that's pretty much what it sounds. They're usually 1 or 2 pages. You turn in the name of your facility, some emissions data, and that's usually about it. Sometimes you'll get something back. Sometimes the states will actually return what you filled out back to you and just simply stamp it as approved, and you're covered. You know, that qualifies you as your permit. I caution you, though, that not all states will have those programs. Outside of registration, they have things called permit by rules. It's really just as it sounds. The state regulation actually lays out everything that you need to do. You generally will have to apply for coverage under that, but again, you may not receive a tailored type of permit document. And these permit by rules where you guys would need to be cautious about, most of the time they will contain grain throughput restrictions. So you really need to check with your state regs or check with your consultants as to whether you can live with those thresholds. We also use general permits, which is another kind of shortened type of permit. They're issued to specific source categories. In this case, we're talking about grain elevators, so there'd be a grain elevator general permit. You apply for coverage under that. What's a little different with these is you generally have to renew them. So every 5 years, if you're under a general permit, you have to go back to the state authority, the permitting authority, and ask for your permit to be renewed. Again, these will also contain throughput limits and sometimes either monitoring and record-keeping requirements. And, again, not all states will have these. So the pros of the registrations, PBRs, and general permits, they're short applications. They can be done relatively quickly. It's quick permit issuance. And most of the time, if you're in these categories, there's fewer inspections and just less overall liability, which is a good thing, right? So these are good options. But there are cons. They're generally less flexible. So, for instance, a permit by rule, that's done through the legislative process and the rulemaking process. So if there's a throughput limit in your permit by rule that you can't live with, there's really no way to change that. So that's a problem. You need to be able to project your throughput. If you apply for coverage under one of these and you're expanding the grain elevator, or if you're just having bumper crop years year after year, it's possible that you can trip your permit category and cause yourself a violation and potential problems. So if you're going to apply for one of these, it's important that you think to the future, not necessarily just today. Outside of those options, you're pretty much left with just obtaining a site-specific permit. Those are things that are tailored to you and your individual facility. This requires a detailed application, usually an application fee, and if not an application fee, emissions fees. And overall, this really just takes a lot of time. So the pros of a site-specific permit, you do have the opportunity to negotiate permit terms, unlike the other types. An example would be truck versus rail shipping. In a permit by rule, the permitting authority may assume that you're going to ship all of your grain by truck, which is a higher emissions scenario, when your facility may only ship out 20% by truck. And that's an opportunity to negotiate and increase throughput that you might need. And then the cons we've already talked about, they're costly and they just take a lot of time. Another type of permit that gets issued, and this is I think one that gets overlooked a lot of times, a lot of state agencies also issue construction permits. So you have an existing facility, but you decide you want to undertake some type of project. Are you planning to make any kind of changes to your existing elevator? Some examples would be new receiving pits, load-out spouts, even adding a grain pile. In these instances, you really should evaluate whether you need to obtain a state construction permit. And I also like to point out, if you're building a greenfield facility, it's almost a certainty this day and age that you're going to need some type of construction permit, they call it. So what I wanted to really kind of stress here is that even though you may have already obtained an operating permit, like we just talked about, those operating permits generally will not cover any kind of expansion that you're planning to do in the future. It does not necessarily excuse you from obtaining a construction permit. Again, the big thing here is time. Construction permits can be very time consuming. I estimate generally between 12 and 18 months. I've even had some very simple projects like adding a load-out spout take 9 or 10 months. Depends on state workload and experience of the permit writer you're dealing with. So I again stress, begin the evaluation as soon as possible. If you are in the planning stages, involve your consultant, involve your environmental people. Basically just start planning for the potential of needing an air permit. And I stress this too, if you do need a construction permit, you almost always have to have that permit before you can actually begin constructing. Good news is though that most states do offer an exemption, but it's variable. So here's a map. I tried to pull out the attendees from the list of this conference. If you're in a blue state, there is some type of construction permit exemption. Unfortunately, if you're from Texas or North Dakota, though, there is no exemption. But just to show the variability, I pulled out the Region 7 states. In Nebraska, if your particulate matter emissions, and again, we're talking PM10, are 15 tons from the project, you don't need a permit. But if you look at Missouri, they do the exemption based on short-term emission rates. So actually 1 pound per hour. So that's a very, very stringent exemption. So Missouri, a lot of projects will need a permit, where the same type of project may not need one in Nebraska. And unfortunately with construction permits, there's just not the same types of options like with operating permits. So they don't make a construction permit by rule or a general permit most of the time. So again, timing is important here. And if you have an existing operating permit and you're needing to apply for a construction permit because you're expanding, be sure that you check your operating permit status as well. Since all these things are emissions driven, if you're expanding your emissions, it's possible that an operating permit option, like a permit by rule that you qualified before, you may not qualify for anymore. So anytime you're expanding, you need to look at both the construction permit ramifications as well as the operating permit.